We are live. Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for joining. I'm very excited to interview Derrick. He's an AI artist and YouTuber. He did his bachelor's in graphic design from University of Cincinnati, and I am a big fan of his YouTube channel. Last year, I started my StyleGAN journey of dataset scrapping, making latent space walk videos, everything inspired by his YouTube channel. And the best part is like all of his videos, he shares the presentation and even the collab scripts. So it really helps a lot of newbies to start experimenting with AI artwork. And I really thank you for making it open source. And I'm doing like a workshop in Digital Futures Conference where I'm sharing about GAN, style transfer, and we clip. And I'm using one of your style transfer collab script in today's workshop. So I'm very excited to interview and host you on this channel, and I hope we can learn a lot, like from your journey, your work, and it has been a huge inspiration. Thanks for your time to do this.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Looks like from my screen you got froze a bit.
Seems okay on my end. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Okay. So first we will discuss a project which you wanted to share.
Yeah, sure. So I'll share this piece is about 60 minutes long, so we won't share all of it, but I'll share maybe the first couple minutes of it, and then we can talk about that from there.
Mhm.
Let me share my screen. Of course, that would happen. let's stop it there. This is a piece called "You Are Here." The concept for this piece is a couple things. So um, the first thing for me that's really interesting about machine learning, especially applied to things like film or video, is that there's this elastic process available in it, right? Like essentially these spaces are infinite, and they can produce more and more detail as we get deeper into them. So the video is essentially the concept of a liminal space, which I know is kind of a hot topic these days. But it's about taking a couple moments in time and stretching them into like these really infinite long spaces. So I think that's one of the really powerful tools of machine learning, is being able to do that. And, that matched with sort of what I find most machine learning produces these very like sort of alien, like they look something like we're familiar with, but also something not familiar. And I think those things combined create this really interesting experience in space.
It was amazing. And whenever, like, even when it was morphing, I could see some abstract shapes, which, like, it's open for interpretation, which is one thing I really like about abstract art. So it looked like there were two or three GAN models you were using. First was with with the letters, and second was it looked like a flower data set with. So I would like to go a bit deeper. So is it latent space walk, and how did you decide on on that particular segment? Like, was it like after a couple of iterations, or what was the process?
Yeah, what's sort of funny about this model is there's actually no latent spacewalk, or what is a latent spacewalk is so obliterated you probably can't tell what it is. This particular piece on the technical side uses, so it does use StyleGAN underneath everything, but the main piece that sort of overlays it is a model called Big Bygan. And what Big Bygan does is it actually tries to translate images you feed it into the closest representation it can find of the Big GAN model. So actually what's underlining all of it, it's kind of funny that you said flower data set, because of course that is something that I use a lot, but this particular piece actually uses a geometric data set underneath it. And the geometric data set is then fed through Big Bygan. And because Big Bygan, or Big GAN, I guess in this case, doesn't have anything geometric in it, it tries to find more natural imagery because that's what it's been trained on. So it ends up finding these flowers, or these, I mean, they sort of look like lily pads or other things to me. So it ends up finding those. And then what I did is actually just took, I think there's something like maybe 36 static frames. And you run it through a model called Super Slow-Mo. And Super Slow-Mo's like main use is that it slows down video, right? So it can take a traditionally speed video and it can slow it down essentially to an infinite speed. But one of the fascinating things about these types of models is if you feed them static frames, right, like frames that have no actual interpolation between them, it will like create some form of interpolation. So it's actually a bunch of static images that are then translated and stretched out infinitely. Like I think it's probably something like 9,000%. So you've got two images that have nothing to do with each other, but using this model, you sort of stretch them out into, again, this like infinite interpolation between them, essentially. So I think it's really, to me, that's a really powerful tool in that, images that are not video or not interpolated are now like, sorry, my cat, as you know from my videos, is going to be in this. So I think to me, this is one of those things that, as someone who's really interested in film, filmmakers always talked about the transition from film to digital video as a way of basically like creating a more plastic potential, right? So it's like film is a series of static frames, they're shot like photography. Video is a signal, and therefore that signal can be stretched, it can be like have things done to it. And I think machine learning is sort of the next evolution of that, which is that we're going from, static frames into a signal into like a space. And that space allows us to really play with the various, dimensions of things, where we're moving, all of those sort of materials. So Yeah, that's sort of one of the really interesting aspects, especially for this piece for me, is being able to take these very static frames and stretching them into like an unlimited, infinite space.
I see. Yeah, that's quite a unique process. So I got the second part where like there was a style gun model of geometric shapes and Bygan of natural images, and it was trying to interpret. But the first part of letters, it I didn't see like that. The model was trying to force into natural images.
Oh yeah, so the text part is actually just taking three single screens of text, and you just run them through super slow mo. So all that is it's just sort of trying to um, animate between those images.
Got it. I see. And yeah, it's quite interesting. And one of the thing I was curious, like you stay up to date with a lot of latest models and uh, ML research community. Like who is your tribe and like how do you stay up to date?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's certainly people on Twitter mostly that I follow. So I mean, I think the big one, and I think the one that everyone follows is the AK account. Um, I think that person is a student at Georgia Tech or was at one point, and they just seem to like I don't know. They must get like a feed from archive.org or something, and they post every interesting paper they see. So that's one place. I mean, I would say the other thing is once you've been in the space long enough, you start to realize that like certain people have certain trajectories of their work, and then you can sort of follow those people and see what the next thing is they're working on. Um, so I'm blanking on their name. It's Jun something Yao, and they are the person that they did the main repository for the Pix to Pix and CycleGAN. Um, and if you follow their work, they are like in every single model. So it's really interesting. You follow people like that, and then just a couple weeks ago, I discovered the work of David Bao, who's an MIT researcher, and I saw his newest model, and I went back and looked at his older work, and it was really, really interesting as well. So, again, I think that for as big of a community as it is, it's also very small. The number of people working in GANs or in, vision models are pretty small, and there are more and more people every day, and I think that's sort of like you just add to the list of people you follow. There are also a bunch of sort of more hobbyists, which I would consider myself sort of on the hobbyist level, right? I'm not doing like research in a lab or that sort of thing. And I definitely think about myself as an artist first before all these other things. But there are, a bunch of folks who I follow and talk to over either my Slack channel or Discord channels or other places. And they're always very helpful, both in pointing me toward new work, but also in sort of helping break down some of these things. Because I don't have a PhD, I don't even have a master's. My bachelor's is in graphic design. So while I understand a lot of conceptually how these models work, I definitely am not like the person that can read the math-heavy papers and understand a lot of it. So yeah, I mean, a lot of it's just like soaking up what information's out there. Playing with stuff and trying to figure it out yourself. And I find that once you get a handle on how most of these things work, you can begin to sort of decipher how other new models work as they come out. The hardest part is like, and this is, to talk a little bit about my class, the hardest part is just like getting started. It is hard to like figure out how to use a GPU. It's hard to figure out like, how to run one of these things. What commands do I run? Like, what's the basic like training process or inference process, those sort of things. So for me, a lot of this was just like, I really struggled to get up and running on something like StyleGAN. So for me, it was like, once I figured out how to do that, then I was like, what other people should like, for me, artists shouldn't be stuck trying to figure out the technical details or like just how to load one of these things. They should actually be involved in making and producing. And from my perspective, like, an artist is still a researcher in machine learning. They're just doing a lot more of the inference or creation work. And hopefully researchers can see how people are using these models and then be able to say like, oh, what if we optimized for this? Or what if we did something in this way? So for me, the more artists that are involved in these processes, the better off this work will become long term. Um, so for me, it was just like, okay, let's like simplify the beginning of this thing, or at least give you the steps to do it. It's not simple, but let's at least give you the business or the process to get there, and then let's see what people can make from there.
I see. And like, and whenever like a colleague or friend of mine asks like how to start AI for design, like I come from architecture design industry. I refer to your channel and ML4A by Gene Kogan. Like those are like I think the best resources just to get like started and have fun and really get involved in that field. So I know I vaguely remember in one of your presentation you mentioned that you went to a conference about where they talked about like machine learning for artists, and there's also one slide you shared about like what are some generative artists and AI artists you recommend. Like, what was your moment where you realized that okay, machine learning is gonna be a game changer in art industry?
I mean, yeah, you bring up Gene Kogan, and Gene was definitely one of the big influences early on for me. I think for me, it was, I had seen, I think like many people, it was sort of like Gene Kogan's work, which, in the early stages, probably a lot of Deep Dream stuff. Mario Klingemann's work, who was doing a lot with sort of pix to pix, a little bit with sort of other GAN generative models. And then Helena Saren's work, who works a lot with CycleGAN. So, seeing all of these sort of artists who are doing stuff, probably a couple of years before I was, it was sort of like, this looks amazing. What is this thing? How do I find out more about this? And yeah, I was lucky enough to attend sort of a week-long workshop at the School for Poetic Computation, which is here in New York. They had Gene in, they had Allison Parrish, a couple other people. So, I was able to sort of learn. It was sort of like a survey course, right? I was able to sort of like see the bigger, the broader system of it. And then from there, I was sort of digging into and trying to figure out how to work with the things that I saw. I mean, I feel like probably took me 2 or 3 months to figure out how StyleGAN worked. Like I didn't really find good tutorials. I don't think Gene had done a StyleGAN tutorial at that point. The repository made sense, but it was like, it seemed really hard. Like I didn't understand a lot of the script meant, how to actually like create the data set, like all of that sort of like took me a while. I mean, it took me definitely a couple months of trial and error, and I just was like constantly frustrated. And I just sort of felt like, yeah, you know what? I don't really want anyone else to go through this experience again. And well, that's not really true. Like I would have just like probably just left it as is or just like tried to help. But like I was fortunate enough, my friend Braulio, who ran a studio space and sort of an after hours like workshop space here in New York, asked me to teach a class. And that really, I have to say, like, quite honestly, I don't think I would have been as much of a machine learning artist as I am today if not for that class, because as soon as you have to teach stuff, it's like, oh, now I have to actually know what I'm doing, right? Like I can like dabble in stuff and just be like, whatever, this works, that's fine. But when you teach something, it's like people have questions and you have to know how to answer those questions. So then you dig into stuff a little bit more and you try to figure things out. And, so being asked to teach that class and teaching that class to 8 artists who were maybe not coders at all, asking them to like work with me on stuff was a big impetus for me to sort of create my classes. And I know Gene at the time was already he had uploaded one of his courses from ITP, and I was just sort of like, yeah, I should just do that. Like, already I'm teaching the class in person. I'll just record these videos of me like doing lectures in a room, and I'm sure those videos are very funny now if you look at them. Like, it's just like literally a screen, and then you hear me like 5 feet away with an AC running, talking. You don't see me at all. But like it was just a way for me to just sort of like record that and put it up for people. And now I think, obviously doing a lot of these classes over Zoom these days, like it's a little bit, the recordings are better. Hopefully the instruction is better, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Like, and was the frustration with uh, not a good resources for data scraping because I used your Instagram scraping video to for my flow plan style again. It was quite useful. So like was all that frustration the reason you started images YouTube channel?
Yeah, I mean, it all sort of plays into each other, right? Which is like basically anything that I can figure out, I will basically share on there if I'm recording or like can record, and it doesn't take me too long, I'll post it to there. Yeah, I mean, the biggest challenge is just like there are not a lot of artists involved in this space. I don't think the tools are really set up for artists or set up for researchers. So over the past 2 or 3 years, it's really been like building up a workflow for myself that I can then share with other people. So, one of the biggest challenges in the world of sort of StyleGAN is the data scraping, data set creation process. And that's something that thankfully doesn't really include machine learning. It's just a lot of, image manipulation, which is something that I'm comfortable with. I have a lot of experience with. I had to learn a little bit more OpenCV than I knew before to get the dataset tools working. And scraping is, a web process, which is something that I'm familiar with from my time as a web developer, front end developer, that sort of thing. So, really, it's just about how do you make tools more accessible to people who are not, deep into coding or that sort of thing. The SSHH classes I teach are really meant for artists and designers, which means you have to sort of change how you can approach things. So in some cases, that means we just look at Runway, which is a nice GUI tool and allows you to sort of get your feet wet in machine learning without having to look at Colab or other like coding interfaces. So sometimes you just start there. Other people are a little bit more comfortable with that. So a lot of the classes I teach outside of SSHH, people can do that themselves or have more comfort with coding. So we'll jump into Colab, or we'll actually look at the code that produces data sets, or we'll actually look at how to manipulate images in OpenCV. So it's really, what I'm really fascinated by is the breadth that we're able to cover across all these classes now, because I've got a good cohort of people who are interested in various topics of it. And, the challenge is always to keep things feeling fresh for myself. One of the things that Leah is one of my co-teachers, one of the things that we talk a lot about is just like, how do we make this interesting for ourselves so we're not teaching the same class over and over and over again? And some of that is there's new models. Some of it is trying new tacks on it. So it's not just like purely make machine learning art. It's like maybe make machine learning art as a filmmaker, or make it as a designer, or that sort of thing. So I think the challenge will be for the next year or two is just like how to keep all this stuff feeling fresh to me, because I have to say I have a bit of a wandering eye, and as soon as stuff starts to feel boring, I will move on. So I think that's one of the big challenges for me over the next couple of years as the classes develop.
Yeah, I can feel that like after a point, even like the style gun model doesn't surprise you anymore. Like earlier, it feels very creative. So it's a good. I'm curious to know like what are some lessons learned like during the classes when people were curating data set, that some strategies work, like what like about diversity of data set, uh, any tips?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I find really fascinating is I talk about my students as researchers, and I think that's really true because if you look at StyleGAN as a whole, the official repositories or the official tools made by researchers cover maybe 10 data sets in total. And they're all like, faces, animal faces, maybe churches, like buildings, like those sort of things. So one of the things that I find really fascinating about the work with my students is like we're doing stuff that no one has studied before. There are no solutions for abstract data sets. This concept of diversity, or how different should your images be from each other, it's studied loosely, but because research models tend to be about how to impress people, they tend to go for the thing that they can find, faces, right? Like people are impressed when you can make a realistic looking face. The challenge of how do I make a abstract model that has diversity and looks good and interpolates well, like, is not something that honestly a lot of researchers like study. So that is something where we, like, as a group, sort of try to figure things out together. And I would say, like, even today I don't necessarily have good answers to it, but I think we're trying to produce more and more tools and or just like learnings from each other. I myself have probably built 20 to 30 data sets and have trained all of them. And I honestly, to this day, still think that there's just some like luck in them. I think sometimes a data set just happens to work and the model like sticks to it. It's like throwing it against a wall, and sometimes the friction sticks correctly and sometimes it doesn't. I'm not entirely sure I could tell you why. I have some theories around alignment or how different your images are, but I think it still always surprises me when someone's like, here's my data set, and I'm like, that won't train, and it trains perfectly well. I'd say like that's one of the fun things, or maybe like the nerve-wracking slash fun things about my classes is often I will say like, yeah, that won't work, and it does. Or like I'll say like, oh, machine learning models don't really work like that, and then like a month or two later someone puts out a new model that proves me wrong and I look like an idiot. But like that's, there again, if we want to keep things feeling fun, that's a way to do it, right? Then the next class can be like, yep, I was wrong, but let's look at this model and see how like they were able to achieve this thing.
And like, do you have any framework by which you judge like, okay, this is good AI art or bad AI art?
Oh man, that's a very complicated question. I think I personally do. Um, for me, there's a couple things that I really try to get to at this point in my AI art. One is that um, I'm trying to reach a point where maybe on some level, like things don't look like what other people are doing, right? Like I think that's always part of it as an artist is like I don't want to just look like what other people are doing. Um, but to me, I'm also really interested in two things. So one being, how do we make AI art that doesn't look like traditional AI art, right? Like Deep Dream or the current interest in Clip, which again, I love all those pieces, but for me, it's sort of like, how do we go beyond that? Um, and two, I'm very interested in sort of that uncanny valley space, the space where things look real, but just not real enough to be like really like purely photographic. And I think that that's an interesting space to be in because, as I mentioned before, researchers are really interested in realism and are trying to like reach this point of like, we can make this thing that looks like a complete face that is gonna like you're gonna think it's real. And I'm not necessarily interested in that space, like personally. I'm interested in the space where things are clearly faked, but like the way in which they're faked feels, I don't want to say magical because I think magical is the wrong word, but just it feels interesting. It creates some sort of like level in your brain that sort of says like, what's going on here? Like, how do I unpack this? Like that sort of thing.
Got it. And this, I'm always confused about like the ownership about AI art, like whether you give credit to the data set of people or the machine learning engineer who coded that model or the artist who curated that data.
Yeah, that's another really deep topic, and one I have a guiding principles on, and one well also saying that I have no answers. For me, a guiding principle is just like crediting people when possible. Um, so I try to make sure that a lot of the tools that I use are cobbled together from other people's work, and I will always try to credit the people who are either providing code or that I'm taking from. In open source work, it's also very challenging to establish credit because some of these things can go through 5 or 6 iterations from someone's work, and all you're trying to do is get things done, and credits get lost very quickly, or little lines of code here and there get modified. But I'm always trying to credit at least the person that I know directly that influenced me, and oftentimes they'll reach out and say like, "Hey, actually, you should credit this person because I just took it and modified a line or two from it." In terms of data sets, you know, I come from the world, or like my interest in art goes back to being in high school and listening to rap music, where a lot of it was using samples. Um, and there was always an interesting world of samples, of the sampling culture at that time, where some of it was, I don't want to tell you where I got the sample from, because like that's like part of the craft, right? Is being able to dig up like these sources. The other side of it is that probably people didn't want to say where it got sampled from because they didn't want to get sued over it. So like there's always this interesting sort of like, there's a triumvirate of like creative process you can own, ethics, and legal definitions, and all those play into I don't know, like a weird space where I think in the past I have been afraid to give credit for data for fear of getting in trouble, and I'm trying to get out of that habit. Um, if someone doesn't want me to use their images, I just shouldn't use their images. That feels like a much better way of working. Um, but I also think that so to get back to the sampling analogy, I think there's like the P. Diddy version where he's sampling like entire songs and like ripping them off, essentially, versus like Bomb Squad era sampling where like things are chopped up into these little pieces and there's like 10 songs combined together. And I think to me that again, maybe to go back about like what is good AI art is like good AI art shouldn't just like recreate the data that's there, right? It should create something new. It should say something different than what was in the data set. And I think to that point, like really well done AI art or well curated data sets will find ways to merge multiple pieces of data from multiple artists or multiple sources into one, where it's sort of you saying like, this is my collection of images and this is how I see these things relating or not relating. Now the challenge there is like a model like StyleGAN will often just repeat those images back to you. So you have to find ways to modify them a little bit or find ways to make that more apparent, right? How do you like take that vision and really make it push it through all the way through the end? But yeah, credit is such a challenging aspect of this work, and it's one of those where I think initially I used to be, well, I can't even say used to be. I think sometimes I get very upset when credit doesn't happen, because I think it's a way of. Oftentimes, I find that some very few people will not give credit as a way to make it look like it's theirs, and that's where I get very upset, because I want to make sure that people are aware that like people are making these things, and the people who make stuff spend a lot of time doing it. They have practices that engage in it. Oftentimes, they are underpaid in it, especially in open source work. So making their credit known is important to me, so that hopefully they can maybe make more money in the future. There are many other people who aren't doing it out of willful negligence, who aren't trying to hurt people or aren't trying to erase them, but just make mistakes or like just don't necessarily know maybe the correct way to cite other people's work. And those people I try to be a little bit more forgiving of, because I certainly am learning and I'm certainly not perfect myself. So, it's really just sometimes it's about trying to determine intent, and that can be very hard, especially on the internet. Yeah, so I think my default mode is give credit where I know credit is due. So if I'm using someone's notebook, I'm gonna say thank you to them, and shout them out. Maybe try to include links to their work or that sort of thing. If I don't know who to thank, then like if people like the other thing is I find that there are a lot of AI artists who, and again, I sort of have a split feeling on this. I think they don't want to talk about how it's made because they're afraid that once you know how it's made, it's no longer magical to you, right? And I think there is a lot of art or technical art that is like, so like all the comments are just like, how did you make that? It's not like, what is this? What's the intent of the artwork? Like that sort of thing. So it's a challenging area. But if someone asks me, how did you make that? I generally, unless they're like being a jerk about it, I'll generally tell them, because I sort of see it as like, if, excuse me, if I want to be the best artist, I can't hide my skills or my technical ability from other people. If someone else can use my tools and make a better art, like that's a challenge for me. It's a challenge for me to make better art too, right? So in some ways, I think again, it's about like building up a good system where you can create better artwork. And sometimes that means you need to be challenged by it. Sometimes it means you need to be challenged by other people's work. And keeping secrets to yourself isn't the way to do that, from in my perspective. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And yeah, even I see on Twitter, everyone asks like, which model, which script did you use? And yeah, I think it would be good if there is like equal balance of people taking interest, like what was the process and like what's the intent of that artwork. It also feels good for the artist who shared.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think part of it's also like as artists, we need to also sort of push on like what's the conceptual point of this artwork, right? Because I'll be blunt, I find a lot of AI artwork doesn't have a conceptual purpose. It's just like I tried a thing, it happened, here it is. And while I think that's fine on some level, like I do think it can feel less like art and more like a study. And I think I do a lot of studies. Like I would say, my Instagram account is mostly me making studies of things or me trying things. But I wouldn't say that those are my artistic pieces, right? Those are sketchbooks, those are notebooks of my work. And that can be a big challenge. Like just the internet flattens everything, right? The internet makes everything either seem like art or everything seem like a study. And I think being clear in your own mind about like, what am I doing here? Am I trying something, or am I actually producing like something that I see as of more value? And again, there's all debates about what if that's really true or like it's in the eye of the beholder. But to me, I do think a lot about like, am I making a sketch? Am I just trying something, or am I using the tools with the intention of making something that is saying something or is bigger than that? And I think that's a big challenge for me. And it's very easy for me personally to get stuck in the like, okay, here's the thing I did in 10 minutes to share to Twitter to get likes or to just share and get retweets, versus here's the thing I'm making with a purpose and an intention and a concept. And sometimes you find that like the thing you shared in 10 minutes gets more likes and more retweets than the thing that you spent a month on. But that's the internet, right? That's not the same as your art practice. And I think like that to me is like, I say that as like, oh, it's clear. Like I'm confident in that. And like every day I'm like, should I really just be making these things that get retweets or like whatever? So it's a big challenge. I think it's just, it's a hard place to work. And I find that I feel better about sharing my work when it's these pieces I've spent some time on and really thought through. But then again, people are like, oh, I really like this one thing. And I was like, man, I threw that up on a Thursday because I didn't have anything else to share. And that's your favorite piece of mine. Okay, cool. All right. Yeah. So it's a funny world.
And like that's a good segue to my next question. That can you share us some examples of AI artwork which had like use cases in real world, or there was some purpose and value?
I don't know. What are you like? Are you thinking about anything in particular? Or like, can you give me some examples of like what you're thinking about?
So, for example, someone made a film using AI, like GAN, or
Mhm.
some advertisement industry approach, and an AI artist made something for them.
Yeah. It's interesting. Working in more design-oriented fields, or I do a lot of editorial illustration. So a lot of my work becomes editorials for places like the New York Times. And those are kind of funny because, again, it's like, what is art versus illustration? It's probably in the eye of the beholder of the use case. But I would say, like, in those cases, what I'm working on is I'm given a piece of text and I'm asked to produce a piece that responds to that text, which is different than, say, like me creating the concept from scratch. So a lot of, I think that's a more common area I know other artists are, making music videos for musicians. I think we're starting to see more commercial uses of AI image making. Like I saw that just recently there was like a shoe brand that was created from a model. I think obviously Robbie Barrett's work with acne is a big case where they were able to make images and those images became clothing. Um, I'm sure AI stuff is being used in architecture, probably in ways that we aren't aware of, or maybe in places that I'm not aware of. Um, so I think there's a lot of opportunities for it. I think the challenge will always be, in my experience, in my work, people often ask me like, "Hey, can you change this little detail?" And it's sort of like, well, I could, but that's not really what the work is, right? The work is I think one of the biggest challenges for designers coming to the space is that you give up control in return for a lot of options and a lot of infinite sort of opportunities. And designers, I'll say as a designer, I've been trained to have hyper control over every single aspect of my work, right? Like every little detail, the font you choose, the spacing on the font, the sizing, all these things. And when you start to work with GANs, you find that you have less control, but you have more opportunity to create really interesting things. And it's where you get to more of a curational perspective than you do a control perspective. Now, I think in the next 5 years, we'll see more of that control coming in because it's clearly something that people want, right? You can already sort of see a lot more Photoshop tools coming into the space so people can begin to really manipulate things on an individual level. But I think right now it's really about what's available to me and how do I use that, right? I sort of think about it as the grain of wood, right? You don't want to cut against the grain because it just produces crappy stuff. But lots of people when they get started first into woodworking want to, right? They want to cut against the grain because they have a vision for this thing. And someone who's been doing woodworking long enough will be like, actually, you want to cut with the grain. So figure out how to do that. Do that first. And I think that's the same sort of feeling that I get with AI art today. Is lots of people come in and they're like, I want to do this, and it has to do this, this, and this in this exact moment. And it's sort of okay, how much time do you have, or how are you willing to spend the next year doing that? And I say, oh, I thought this stuff was fast, and it's well, yeah, it's fast if you go with it, I think that's the big challenge for a lot of artists is coming into the space and just sort of understanding that there's a process that is accepted, and to break that process is fine, but you're gonna be in a world of pain to do it, right? So it's sort of what's your comfort level to get there?
Nice. And is it more difficult to or challenging to communicate AI artwork with clients?
It's definitely a different process. I used to try to just avoid having that conversation, and it never, and then the projects never went well. So now I do have those conversations up front. I say, look, I need a week lead time just to train my model. If I have to produce a new data set for it, it's going to take me even longer. So I try to ask for lots of time, not because I think lots of time is just a nice thing to have, but because I actually need it. From a technical perspective, I need it. So that's the first conversation I have. Then I have a conversation about okay, what sort of control do you want over this thing? Because I can do control, but then we're talking about moving it into After Effects and me doing a lot of post-processing work, which just means my hours will be more. Or if you're more flexible, I can tell you what will work and what will take us less time, but you'll have less control over it, right? It'll be more sort of I don't know. There's some sort of Zen metaphor here of you're in the stream and you're either swimming against the current or you're with the current. And with the current will always feel better. You'll feel more powerful. But it just depends on what you're trying to achieve. So having those conversations is sometimes easy, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes I just am fuck it, I'm just going to do the hard work and not have this conversation anymore. So it's a balancing act, I think.
Got it. And do you have any utopian or dystopian vision with AI in digital art?
I have a ton of dystopian visions for it. I mean, I think it's clear to say that the way machine learning is used outside of an artistic perspective, and even honestly sometimes mostly within the artistic perspective, is very bad. I don't. I've toyed with the idea of taking a job in machine learning that is like my full-time job. I honestly couldn't tell you where would be a good place to work because I think all of them are doing bad things with their machine learning tools. And I think that that's something that I'm trying to approach with in my own work more often now is in addition to making things with machine learning, talking a little bit about what I think machine learning should be and how we should approach it. And, I think that's something that comes up in my classes as well, is I try to talk about, look, your first idea will be like to take a bunch of cultural things and blend them together. And my first response will be like, please stop and think about that before you do it, right? Like, there was a year or two where there was like, I was getting a lot of requests to blend white faces into faces of color, or, change races between people. And I had to say no to all that work because it was just like, no, that's like, it's just because the image looks like a thing doesn't mean you're like applying cultural ideas to it. So, so much of this is a challenging space to work in. I think there are social and ethical concerns about machine learning art that we need to think about. I think we've talked about some of them already, which is like sampling. Like, who do you owe credit to? Do you need to pay someone for that work? Like that sort of thing. I think there are certainly ethical concerns outside of just the artistic practice of, where is your data coming from? What are the biases built into that data? Who are you affecting when you release these things in a commercial perspective? I think there are artistic value statements to apply to these things as well, which we've also discussed. And I think there are also like ecological concerns, like using high-powered GPUs for all this stuff is not environmentally friendly. Let's put it that way. So, how are you reusing your models? How are you approaching things in a smart way? And I'll say like that's another reason why I try to teach with the way I teach is like, if you aren't going to approach things with some knowledge of like what I've learned, you're likely going to burn through a couple days worth of work, and that's like a GPU that is burning a lot of power for nothing, right? So it's sort of like it's almost a moral imperative for me to share what I've learned because it's better for the environment in the long run if you can sort of like take some of my learnings with it. So I think there are so many potentially bad things happening in machine learning that when I have friends that are like, I can't believe you work in that stuff. It's like so gross. And I'm like, I don't disagree with you. I think there's definitely lots of bad opportunities within machine learning. But it's that old adage of just like, well, if no one good is involved in it, will it ever be good? Do you give up on it and just sort of like let the Facebooks and the Googles of the world sort of ruin it? Or do you push back and try to do the best you can? I've got other places where I choose to opt out of being engaged in that stuff, and this just happens to be one where I'm willing to stick it out. Or like, I think there's enough potential here that, maybe with the right group of people or, enough, I feel like that's probably fairly naive of me, but maybe it's like just to say, like, I think that there can be a space carved out for this work that does speak to the ethical, ecological, and social concerns and make that a little bit clearer and better for everyone.
And I'm seeing like also in machine learning conferences there are like fair AI workshop, explainable AI, no code AI, like to make it accessible and have very diverse perspective. So it's a small like there is a movement, but definitely there is a big part which is a bit messed up. Yeah. So for someone who is just getting started with creative AI work, what are some models or libraries you suggest experimenting with?
I mean, definitely, I think my first recommendation for anyone getting started, is to start in Runway, especially if you have no coding background. Just getting into the coding stuff is it can just be kind of frustrating. You get lots of errors and you're like not sure what's going on. So I would say starting with Runway is always a good option. Not to plug my stuff too much, but I have a couple of Runway classes if people are interested in checking those out. I find that they tend to be Um, Once you understand how machine learning works, which is like you have to sort of understand the paradigm of input and output, and you sort of know what your input is and figure out what your output is, I think things get a little bit easier from there. So I definitely say Runway is the best place to start. Um, I think the models that I like inside Runway like tend to be the translation models. They tend to be fairly fast. So stuff like Big Bygan. There's one called Attention GAN, which generates images from text. It's a couple years old. It's not nearly as fun or as cool as Clip, but it works. Um, so I'd say starting there, just sort of like playing around in some of those models. Leah and I have recorded a lot of little tutorials for each model, or for many of the models on there. So if you are interested, you can go to my channel, and if you find a model and you just don't know how it works, like just search for that model name, and hopefully you can find a tutorial on that there. Once you've sort of done that, I think then it's like, then you can maybe train your own model. So like the StyleGAN training inside Runway isn't my favorite, but it works. It's also fairly expensive. So, plan ahead. Once you get into that world, then you have to start thinking about how to make a data set. How to make a data set is hands down the hardest part of machine learning. It's why so many people are into Deep Dream and Clip, because it doesn't require that step. So I think, if you, after you spend a couple weeks on Runway, if you're like, I'm ready for that next step, then it's making a data set. And making a data set is a super challenging process, but it's one that I think makes you stop and think about what you're doing. What are all the images I'm collecting? Are they just cool images? Are they like a collection of a similar idea or a similar object? How do I align them? How do I crop them? How do I, do all this work? Because it's a really big challenge. But I think that's the next step. And then once you've got the hang of that, then I feel like you're pretty much set free to like start to explore a lot of areas.
Yeah, even I started with the Runway ML. It's pretty straightforward. And are there any conference or workshops you recommend to stay up to date, like which are focused more on AI art?
Um, yeah, I mean, I would say Elliot Luba tends to organize a lot of the conferences. Um, did I say Elliot Luba? Wow, I'm blanking on her. I'm blanking on their name right now. Her last name is
With
Luba.
Neuro IPs, Neurops.
Yeah, so she runs one of the workshops for NeurIPS, and then I think she also did one recently for either ICCV or CVPR, and those tend to be they're sort of a juried work. You submit work, and you can sort of see. I think there's something usually like 40 or 50 projects every year that are accepted into those shows, and I think they often do conferences with them as well. I think just going in and seeing the work that other people are producing is a helpful way to understand like what's out there, as well as sort of maybe what AI artists are working with and tools and other things. I'm always surprised at the breadth of that work. There are people who are doing painting using robotics, and there are people who are doing stuff with sound, and there are people who are doing video and film like myself. So there's always a lot of opportunity to sort of see the wide breadth of things. Then it's really down to like what tools are available to me, and so that comes into, are you good at coding? Do you have experience in things like robotics or 3D or other things? So from there, it's sort of creating your own path. And I think the truth is, YouTube has gotten a lot better for tutorials. There are now a bunch of artists who like upload tutorials and stuff. I feel like when I started, there weren't that many, but now there's a handful of them, and many of them are better than mine. So I definitely would recommend checking out those. Again, following artists on Twitter or Instagram is a good thing. You don't have to ask them what models they use. A lot of times, like if you just dig through their comments or replies, like you'll see some responses there, and that might give you enough information to just go like, truth about all this stuff is having a good like Google skills are really important. Being able to Google something, oh, I heard about StyleGAN. Okay, let me look that up and see what's there. Or I heard about Clip. Like what's Clip like? Clip plus machine learning art. Like what does that get me? a lot of just doing some digging and trying to figure things out yourself.
What's your favorite AI art?
Um, my favorite AI art, oh my God, I'm like totally blanking on names today. Is a piece by, oh my God, why am I blanking on his name? Oh, Memo Acton. And he has this really beautiful piece from a couple years ago that uses, I believe, either Pix2Pix or CycleGAN. And it's a dual screen setup where you sort of have a number of objects that you can manipulate in space. So either like cables and your iPhone cords or other things, some plugs, some other pieces, and then there's a screen that is sort of taking that and manipulating it. And he just has this beautiful experience of sort of like the video opens with sort of like him manipulating a piece of cloth, and the cloth is then converted to like waves or the ocean. Then you add in these cables and these other pieces, and it starts to become rocks and other things. I just think there's like a beautiful sort of metaphor for both art and then also just like, I don't know, the way that artists, especially machine learning artists, work, working with these very clunky tools to create these very beautiful things. Yeah, so I'm blanking on what the name of that actual piece is, but I'll send it to you and you can link to it later. Yeah, I think that piece like really seeing that piece really gave me an idea for also how like performance could work in machine learning art. Like I am not an artist who uses performance as a part of my medium, but I think there are lots of artists who are beginning to realize that performance is a part of this, whether it's the body or whether it's these things manipulated like by hand. I just think there's lots of opportunity to do some interesting work there.
I saw Richa, you unmuted your mic. You wanted to ask something?
Yeah, first of all, this conversation. Hello.
Yep. Hi.
Was I disconnected?
Maybe just for a
hi.
second. Yeah.
Yeah. So the conversation is going about, like how we deal with things in our industry. But I would like to know any of your work from where you started from a conceptual thing, like just a sketch on a paper, to your actual final idea. Can we go something like that? Like maybe the process, how you went from a single line to a whole full output.
Yeah, it's sort of funny. Like I have never been a sketching person. I always sort of have an idea in my head, and I will manipulate that sort of in with tools. I mean, I will say a lot of the editorial illustration work I do, I at least have like a pencil sketch of it, and then I will like try to manipulate that in either Illustrator or Photoshop or something. But I think one of the things that's really interesting to me about machine learning as a whole is that like manipulating these tools, like you sort of get ideas just from sort of the back and forth play of how these things operate. A lot of my work is, again, throwing stuff against the wall and seeing what sticks. And then once I see a thing that sticks, it's like, okay, what else is there that could be similar? So, a lot of the work that I do, which we haven't really talked about here, is like I do stuff with what's called next frame prediction, which is feeding a video into this model, and then it tries to predict literally the next frame. So it generates more video. And one of the things I've really enjoyed with that experience is like working with like really basic ideas of motion. So I'll take like static images and I'll bring them into After Effects and do like something like a zoom on it. So that generates a video, or rotating it, or doing some other sort of process to it, feeding that through a model and sort of seeing how the model interprets really simple motion. And that's like, to me, maybe that's like my version of a line, or my version of these sort of more simple structures. And then it becomes, okay, if I'm using these basic sort of grammar of motion, how do you combine those things into something, or what's the actual content you're using, and how does that then speak to things? So a lot of it is, I tend to work a lot with organic pieces, like ocean, flowers, those sort of pieces. In part because I think machine learning, one of the things that's really interesting to me about machine learning compared to like, I did a lot of work in generative art previously, like processing or open frameworks. One of those things is that those things generate straight lines very well. But they don't generate photographic images very well. Whereas machine learning is really good at photographic images. So I almost look more to instead of thinking about drawing, I think more about like photograms or artists of early photographers from like the 1890s to 1930s, right? What sort of things were they experimenting with image-based photography, and how could those then be applied to machine learning today? So I think a lot about photograms, or using sort of silhouettes and outlines, and trying to do that to generate more complex photographic imagery.
Awesome.
Yeah, and then Oliver said it's Memo Acton learning to see. So yeah, thank you for that.
Looks like the last question I have is what are some common mistakes you observe when people are starting with creative AI, or is there anything you wish you would have done differently in your career?
I see a lot of common mistakes. The most common mistake I see is that people try to really quickly produce their project. Like I will often get emails from students who are, oh, I have to finish this thing in 2 weeks or in 2 days. What can I do? And it's like, wow, you've never done this before, and you want to try to finish this in 2 days. Like that is really challenging. So, I mean, the first thing I would say is give yourself time. Like that's the number one thing is don't try to rush yourself, because you will often find there are issues that you didn't expect that you'll run into. Just quite honestly, like this stuff always takes longer than you think it does. I think there's always the hype cycle of like, this stuff's really fast. Like you can generate images in seconds. And while that's true, you often need to like know what you're doing before you get there. So yeah, I think for me, it's slow down, take your time, plan ahead, or like figure out the steps you need to get there. A lot of times you don't know the steps, and that's its own process. I would also say like the hype cycle of machine learning is very high right now. It's probably actually a little bit lower than it was this time last year or the year before, but it's still very high. So one of the first things I always do in my classes is just like we look at a demo like that is attention again, and I say like this is supposed to generate good high quality images from text, and it does a really poor job. And that's part of it is like this stuff looks cool. Like you see FHQ, which is the face model from StyleGAN. You think, wow, that must be able to do that for anything, right? And you quickly find out that like they're kind of cheating in a couple ways. They're cheating because faces actually are very easy to produce. Plus the history of like computer vision is really based around faces. So you have a long head start. Also, they align their data in a way that makes it look really, really cool. But it's actually like that essentially is the trick. Most of us can't align our data that well, so like that's another challenge. But yeah, I would just say like sounds kind of bad, but like lower your expectations, because what you produce will often not be what you would expect to produce. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that like opens up opportunities for inspiration. But often I find people are disappointed by their first result or their second result. And then it's about like, okay, well, what could I do here to make this better? Or what do I want to do to make it better, right? Is it just like, this is a challenging problem and I need to change my focus? Or are there actual things I could be doing to edit that? So yeah, I would say like the first thing is just like really give yourself more time than you expect.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Okay, I have a personal question. Like, what is that line that you hold to when you fall into some ugly situations? Like, when you are in some difficult situation, what is that one line that keep you motivated and say, let's do it more, let's stretch it more further?
The funny thing for me is it's like, well, I can go do 10 other things. So sometimes it's like, again, to the point of like, you need more time. Sometimes I need to just step away from something and give it a month, 2 months, 3 months, learn some new things or learn other things. Then I'm like, oh, actually I figured that out. And like, now I can come back to it, right? Sometimes when you're so deep in that, like, okay, I have to solve this right now, that like you don't have the right headspace or the right perspective to actually be able to do it. So I would say a lot of times for me, it's just like actually put it down and walk away from it. Even though that's the thing you don't want to do. So I have a number of projects that I've like sort of walked away from, and I finally feel like 5-6 months later now I'm actually ready to go back to and be like, okay, I actually know what to do with this now, because previously I wasn't. So yeah.
That's the power of, unconscious. Like it's in your head. You don't know, but you're working and actively finding the solution for it. After some time, you get the answer. That's
For sure.
pretty clever.
I have one funny and sorry, Oliver, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, hi. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you for talking this evening. It's been super interesting to hear your experience and work, Derrick. And actually, I came across your work because I suddenly had interest in Mario Klingelman's work, and then through the metaverse ended up stumbling upon your YouTube channels. But yeah, thank you so much for your generosity of kind of like sharing this out there and making it accessible for other artists as well. So yeah, really, thank you.
Yeah, of course. No, I'm glad to hear that. I love hearing that people found use for my videos. So that's really, I'm appreciative of that.
Thanks for sharing. So one funny optional question is like, what is one thing that most people don't know about you, but will be surprised if they know it?
I mean, normally I would say like that I'm like a huge cat fan, but people who watch my videos know that because my cats end up in half my videos. Especially the brown one. She loves to interrupt me when I'm trying to record videos. I was recording a video last night and she just started wailing at the top of her lungs. I like had to stop the video, pick her up, and hold her for the rest of the video. So yeah, I don't know what else. I don't know. I feel like it's kind of funny. I feel like most people would know a lot about me if you watch my videos just because of the work I talk about. I mean, I guess maybe one thing that people don't really know about is I am a big soccer fan. Like I'm missing the Euros right now to record this, so big. It's a big trade-off. No, it's fine. It's just the Croatia Netherlands game, so I think I'm fine. But yeah, I'm a huge soccer fan. Follow the team here in New York, which is the New York Red Bulls, a lot. So that's sort of like quite often, like when people ask me like, how do you do all this work? Half the time it's like I'm working while a game is on, and I like have one eye on the game and one eye on making a data set. I think that's like one of the things about doing this work, and I think this is something that Zach Lieberman, who does a lot with open frameworks, has said as well. Is like you'll often find that he's writing code in a taxi cab while he's like going to an airport or coming home from a conference. I think that like one of the things about artists is that you just sort of have an internal need to make stuff. And to me, that means that like what I end up doing is I find ways to fit making stuff into my day. Like, so if I'm having lunch, I'm like, while I'm eating lunch, I'm also checking out like how did my model train overnight or whatever it is. If I'm watching a soccer game, like except for the Red Bulls, like I'm generally like one eye on the game and one eye like I'm like doing some Photoshop work to make a data set. So I think that is one of those things about like just making room for your work. And I hate to say that like, oh, that's what makes you an artist, because I think like lots of people have their own ways of navigating their spaces, and some people can work sort of multitasking and others can't. But I do find for me that like multitasking is one of the ways that I'm able to like achieve the amount of work that I do. And I sort of adapted to it. I don't know if that's like a bad thing psychologically or if it's just like it's how I've learned to adapt, but yeah.
I see. Yeah, everyone has their own way to get into the flow state. So I must say it was a very fun and insightful interview. Thanks a lot for sharing all the thoughts and being very humble and honest with us. It really helps to learn from your journey, and I highly recommend checking out Artificial Images YouTube channel. And if you have the opportunity and you want to get started with creative AI, definitely enroll for Derrick's course. It gets filled up soon, so don't miss out on that.
Yeah, and so all of my classes are online. They usually go up a month or two after the classes are finished. So I just finished 2 new courses, and they'll go up in a month or two. I am taking the summer off so that I can work on some of my own artwork, but probably in the fall I'll be announcing new classes. And you can find out about those new classes either through my Twitter or YouTube accounts, or I have a newsletter as well. You can sign up from my webpage. Yeah, so hopefully I'll see some of y'all in those classes in the future. And thanks for having me.
Sure.
Sure.
Thank you.
We
We
are
won't
gonna.
take much of your time from watching soccer.
You already cursed.
All right, well, thank you so much, everybody.
Okay, bye
Thank
guys.
you.
And thank you,
Bye
Maya.
bye.